Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 65 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. I'm joined by Thomas Maier, an award-winning investigative journalist who has worked at Newsday since 1984. Thomas has also written several books over the years, including When Lions Roar, about the Churchills and the Kennedys, and Masters of Sex, which was produced as a series on Showtime for 4 years. I invited Thomas onto the podcast to discuss his most recent book, Mafia Spies, the inside story of the CIA, gangsters, JFK, and Castro. His book discusses the relationship between several senior figures in organized crime in the early 1960s and members of the Central Intelligence Agency who wanted Fidel Castro dead, and how they formed a temporary alliance to accomplish that together. But before we get into that discussion, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including James H. and Brian A. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Thomas, first of all, thank you for taking the time to sit down with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My longtime listeners on the podcast here know that Fidel Castro and Cuba in the 1960s have come up many times on this podcast in the past, but that's because really it's just a source of endless intrigue, to be honest, as I'm sure you're well aware.
Oh, absolutely. Just anybody who's ever been to Cuba knows about its natural beauty, and it's so close to the United States, but also hard for, I think, younger people to realize how much of a bête noir Castro was back in the 1960s, in a way even more so than, say, Osama bin Laden as a more contemporary comparison. I think Castro just was such a challenging figure for both the government and I think even in the minds of many Americans who used to go down to Cuba and such. So this doesn't surprise me because it's also a problem or question that has yet to be fully answered, even though Castro is now gone.
Oh, I know. I still feel like there will be, even, as much as 60 years later, there's still going to be some revelations coming one way or the other in the end. But your book does cover a facet or some facets of that whole situation that I have not previously covered here on the podcast, which is why I invited you on in the first place. And I wanted to go in much more in depth with it today.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. There were a number of revelations in my book that a number of them come from the JFK assassination papers that President Trump, about 3-4 years ago, he didn't stop the scheduled release of the records from that. And actually those records, although they didn't have any particular big revelation about the JFK assassination itself, what it did provide was a lot of detail about the Cuba operation that was being conducted by the CIA and specifically about the two protagonists in my book, Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, the two mobsters that were hired by the CIA to kill Castro.
Oh, yeah. I can't wait to dive into their story. And I'm curious, Thomas, was the release of these documents that you just mentioned, was that the catalyst for you to write this book, or were you already working on that when those documents were released?
Well, in a way, Mafia Spies, my book, is kind of the third in a trilogy about the Kennedys. And it's funny because all three of the books started by themselves. In other words, I didn't plan to write a trilogy of Kennedy books. My first book was about it's called The Kennedys, America's Emerald Kings, and basically it's a big fact book. Came out about 20 years ago, and it's about how the Irish Catholic immigrant experiences of the Kennedy family reaching all the way back to Ireland, how it impacted the family's public and private lives. And I found that to be a big hole in the Kennedy story. So it was essentially the story of the Kennedy family through the prism of their Irish, Catholic, and immigrant experience. And so that was the first book. The second book, I was prompted just while they were making Masters of Sex, my book about Masters and Johnson, into a TV show. I happened to be speaking to somebody, and they pointed out an article about Winston Churchill in the New Yorker. And I said, well, the Kennedys used to be good friends with Churchill. And actually, that seems to be very much at odds at the traditional view of the relationship between Joe Kennedy and Winston Churchill, who differed very strongly about World War II. But before that, in the early 30s and in even the mid 30s, there was a considerable amount of exchange between the two families. So that book was about the Churchills and the Kennedys. But in both those two books, I did make mention about Sam Giancana and what had happened in Cuba. And so I realized that I would like to do a book first about Giancana, but then I realized his buddy, if you will, Johnny Roselli, was equally, probably more fascinating. And so Mafia Spies is the third in this Kennedy trilogy. And it's a much more critical book about the Kennedys in that regard. But it's what I was always fascinated about was the relationship of the two gangsters, almost like a buddy movie, almost like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You have this relationship between these two gangsters, and that kind of was the window for telling this story.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating prism, just like you mentioned a moment ago, to give a lot more insight into so many of the major events that were happening there. And these two guys, I mean, they were right at the center of it in so many ways. I mean, they were so connected to all of those events and all of the personalities as well. It's very interesting stuff.
Yeah,
So,
it was to me always fascinating. I've covered the mob. In fact, I used to work as a reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times 40 years ago, and I remember an assassination of one of the mobsters there and covering that and such. So it's always held some fascination for me. But this was once I knew that about them, realized the relationship, the friendship between these two mobsters, and almost telling the story as a buddy movie, if you will. That type of framework. I thought it was something that I couldn't resist at all.
absolutely. Yeah, I'm certainly glad that you wrote the book because it was quite an interesting read, and it's going to be a great conversation as well. So, if we could go back to the beginning, kind of like I said, I've talked about Cuba in the 1960s quite a bit on the podcast, but just in case anyone's tuning in right now for the first time and they're not totally familiar with this history, can you kind of explain why it was that there was such a strong desire to get Castro any way that they could by the Kennedy administration, by the CIA, from late 1959, early 1960s as well? Like, why did he have such a bullseye on him, and on this small, relatively poor island nation south of Florida?
Well, just bear in mind, in the mid 50s and such, and certainly for 20 years or so, Havana and the casinos and the whole nightlife in Cuba was the place that was bigger than Las Vegas. If you lived in anywhere on the East Coast during the wintertime, if you wanted to go for a getaway where you could gamble and be entertained and such, you would go down to Havana rather than Las Vegas, which still really had not developed. Havana, so it was run by a fellow named Batista, a dictator named Batista. And that was something that people were aware of. Originally, Fidel Castro was portrayed, certainly in the press here in the United States, as a quote progressive, or somebody who was going to be a reformer, and he was overthrowing the dictator Batista. Turns out, though, he became a satellite, or he became a surrogate of the Soviet Union very quickly. And so his communist underpinnings was one of the things that really alarmed the United States government. When that happened about 1959, in that time period, 57, there was the Sputnik shooting off of the Sputnik satellite by the Soviet Union. And suddenly the Russians seemed like they were ahead of us in the space race. So that was one crisis. But then the other satellite, if you will, of the Soviets was the satellite nation that they had now created in Cuba. So the idea that you had the Soviets there eventually putting in nuclear weapons in Cuba, within a few years, there was a huge crisis in Cuba. And it went from a place where people would go to relax. And even though it was run by a dictator, they would go to casinos to suddenly being the ground zero for World War III.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly that changed and how it became like a central focus of American foreign policy and, like clandestine activities and all of that. So why specifically do you think that they decided to try to kill Castro, and beyond that, why were they so unsuccessful after so many attempts?
Well, I think the fear was that Castro would infect all of Latin America. That, in other words, with the Soviet behind him, and essentially as the Soviet puppet, Castro and Che Guevara and such would would promote communism in throughout Central and South America. That was the perception of it. And the other thing is, the fellow who was running the CIA in 1960 was a fellow named Alan Dulles, who was actually a very skilled spy. He had made his bones, if you will, during World War II. He particularly out of Switzerland. He was working for the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA. And he was a very successful spy. But I think people who came out of World War II, like Eisenhower, the president, and Alan Dulles, they I think one of the questions that they often thought was there was attempts to try to kill Hitler during World War II. And of course, the question is if Hitler had been assassinated earlier on, if they had dealt with that problem in that way, could war or certainly something like the Holocaust have been reduced, if not eliminated, if Hitler had been assassinated early on? And I think Dulles was certainly aware of people who thought that way during World War II. So I think the same type of existential crisis is the way they perceived Fidel Castro in the late 50s. And that's why Eisenhower agreed to this. This was a plan that came up through the ranks with the CIA, but essentially it was Alan Dulles' idea. And it was executed initially in the last days of the Eisenhower administration, and then it was adopted by the Kennedy administration as well.
Mhm. I see. Yeah, I can definitely understand they were not that far removed from World War II at that time, of course, and the idea that you wanna kind of nip something in the bud, to use an analogy for murdering someone, of course, I can see the value in that, and in some ways, they were correct, of course. I mean, Castro and Che Guevara did very much try to spread communism all over the world after that, although they were not as successful as they hoped. And again, that's a subject that we've covered here a few times on the podcast. But what were some of the early attempts before they actually got to the mafia guys that are the subject of your book? Like, how did they actually go after Castro initially?
Well, there's a number of different attempts to kill Castro. There was one woman who was a former lover of his, and the CIA provided poisons that were put in cold cream. And she went down to see him, and unfortunately, the capsules of poison actually melted in the cold cream that it was being hidden in. So that was a problem there. There were a number of different attempts, none of them obviously successful. Castro wound up dying only a few years ago. He was a very old man. So he survived literally dozens of attempts. One of the things that I became aware of through my research, particularly in this most recently declassified and released JFK assassination papers, one of the things that becomes very clear is that Castro had a very elaborate spy system that he learned from the Soviets, but he had a number of different double agents in Florida as well, which is where a lot of the attempts to assassinate Castro emanated from. They were coming out of southern Florida, where the CIA had a base and where there were Cuban exiles that were being trained. We were essentially running an undeclared war out of Florida for a number of years there, overseen by the CIA and eventually by like Bobby Kennedy, as an example, being involved in that. But those attempts were not successful. What becomes very clear is that Castro had a very good spy system that was able to tip them off. Certainly, probably the clearest example is when the Bay of Pigs attack happened. Castro's forces were essentially waiting. They were all set and waiting for the invading exiles who were attacking at the Bay of Pigs, who were coming over. And so that became a disaster for the Kennedy administration. It became and certainly became a tragedy for the Cuban exiles that were met and roundly defeated at Bay of Pigs. But partly the reason for that, it seems as though Castro was tipped off not only there, but a number of other attempts. There were individual attempts where the Castro people seemed to be tipped off about that. And the CIA didn't quite realize that until later on. They had a change of administration overseeing things. And there was a guy named Bill Harvey who was kind of known as the James Bond of the CIA. And he gets involved in that. And he eventually realizes that, wait a minute, there's too many of these attempts that are failing. And the records that I examined gave much more detail about that, about Harvey, about the conversations in the CIA, about the various different failed attempts, and then also about the double agent nature of some of the people that the CIA was doing business with. They were not only double agents, I guess they were triple agents. And in other words, the people that the CIA thought was going to help them kill Castro, they had their own reasons not to do so.
Yeah, that's a story that played out many times. It seems it was very, very hard to find anyone who could get in and out of Cuba and who was reliable and who was not compromised. I mean, they tried a lot of different ways from what I understand, and it never really worked out in the way that they had hoped that it would, certainly. And there were plenty of volunteers. I mean, I've talked to some of those guys in the past here on the podcast, like Felix Rodriguez, for example, but plenty of volunteers, but they could never get anyone close enough to him to actually end his life. So at what point did they eventually turn to the mafia, who are the subject of your book? When did they do this? After like 5 attempts or 10 attempts, or after 2 years of constant trying, or what exactly?
It was relatively early on in the process. It was somewhere in like March, I believe, of 1960. And what happened was that the CIA decided that they wanted to kill him, but they didn't want to get their hands dirty at all. So what they would have is a cutout or buffer, if you will, a middleman, a go-between. And his name was Robert Maheu. And he was a very interesting guy in and of himself. He had worked quite a bit for the CIA previously, but he happened to know Johnny Roselli. And he essentially he courted Roselli. They went to dinner, they talked about it. And essentially what Roselli saw for the mob was that it would be a get out of jail free card for them. That basically, if they helped the CIA, that the government would be so thankful to them that they would look the other way at their illegal activities. But also it would allow the mob to come back into Havana and reestablish their casino operations, which were worth millions of dollars back then. So there was a lot of incentive for Roselli to consider this. It was still a hard sell with the mafia. And so he went to his direct boss and longtime friend, Sam Giancana, who was the head of the outfit. He was the head of the mob in Chicago. And at that time, we're very aware through The Godfather and other type of movies and such about the 5 families, mob families in New York. Other cities have mob families as well. But Chicago was it was the mob of Al Capone. And this is what was being run at that time by Sam Giancana. And Giancana and Roselli were contemporaries, but they were friends. And Roselli convinced Giancana to become part of it. And so that's where the story begins. They actually meet with the CIA at a hotel, the Fontainebleau in Miami Beach. And that's where the story begins. In a way, it's where the story ends as well.
Yeah, that's what a nexus point in history that was, really, when I think about it. I mean, it's really fascinating stuff. The people that are showing up on opposite sides of the table, so to speak. And, the Fontainebleau of all places, I know that's an absolute icon in South Florida even now. So what was
Yeah.
it that actually, what is it that actually got these guys to the table? Like you mentioned Robert Maheu, how in the world did he arrange this meeting exactly? You said that he had done some work with the CIA before. Was that like as an employee or as a private contractor or what exactly?
Well, he had worked at the FBI, but then he became kind of a contractor for the CIA. He was involved, for instance, in sexually compromising the Indonesian leader Sukarno, who came to New York, and they arranged for Sukarno to meet with essentially a prostitute or somebody who was willing to sexually compromise him and such. But Mayhew's main gig was working for Howard Hughes, the billionaire, the richest man in the world at that point. And Howard Hughes was quite eccentric, and Maheu was his eyes and ears to the outside world. And so that was part of it. Hughes did a lot of work with the government, a lot of defense work with the government. So Maheu had all these various different connections. And he claimed to have debated in his mind about whether or not he, Maheu, as a good Jesuit trained Catholic, and I'm in the same ballpark. I went to Jesuit school, Fordham. He went to Holy Cross. But he said he later said that he debated in his mind whether or not he would be excommunicated from the church if he decided to help out on this assassination scheme. But ultimately he did, and he became the middleman there. And so he set it up at the Fontainebleau with a meeting between the CIA agents that were dealing with this directly, Maheu kind of in the middle, if you will, and then Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and a third mobster also that was brought in by Giancana. His name was Santo Traficante, and he was the mobster of Tampa, Florida. He also spoke Spanish, and he was a second generation gangster, and he was ostensibly helping out, partly as a courtesy, if you will, to these other two mobsters, helping them to get going and be involved in this plan, kill Castro. But as I reveal in this book, Santo Traficante was a much more complicated figure. Whether or not he was really on the side of the other two gangsters trying to kill Castro, or if he had his own agenda, and was he ultimately involved in some of the most fateful decisions in this book, is something that I think the readers can examine by reading the book and coming to at the conclusion what exactly Santo Traficante's role in all of this was, is something that I think is still undecided today.
Yeah, that's amazing that there's still so many unanswered questions even 60 years later. So, well, what did Giancana think, at least, that he was bringing Traficante in for? I mean, obviously, I understand he's a Spanish speaker, and that might help in, dealing with Cuba. But what else did he bring to the table that was worth, bringing on another person who was aware of this conspiracy?
Well, he had contacts Traficante had contacts in the Cuban exile world. So, in other words, when Castro came to power, there were thousands of people who fled, primarily to the Miami area, some in Tampa, but there was a large Cuban exile community in Florida who were extremely angry about having been pushed out of their homeland by this communist Castro. And so they were very willing to take up arms and do something about it. Traficante had more contacts than certainly Giancana, who's based in Chicago, and even Roselli, even though they did have some contacts from their experiences in Havana when they were running their own casino, mob run casino in the Havana area. But once they were pushed out, it was really Traficante who had all of the contacts. And there was one particular person who they were going to try and poison Castro. There was a debate at the Fontainebleau about, well, exactly how do we want to kill Castro? And the CIA wanted the mob to try to kill Castro with guns in some manner. And they said, well, no, we'd rather do it more subtly and where we don't get killed either. And let's try to poison first. And so the attempt with Traficante as well was to get a Cuban exile, was a Cuban who had proximity to Castro, to poison him. And that went on and on and on. First, there were difficulties because of how to poison them and how to make sure that the capsules of poisons would work the way they were intended. So there was difficulties on the CIA end initially, but then once they had the pills, that seemed to be slow walk, the poisoning. It seemed to take forever, and it never really did happen. And ultimately, Traficante said that the Cuban fellow, Juan Orta was his name, had gotten cold feet at the last minute. And so therefore the attempts to poison Castro, at least that attempt, went by the wayside. But that went on for the better part of a year. So there were other attempts that were very notable later on in the book. But that was a big part of it. I should also hasten to mention that Giancana had a former cop who spoke Spanish who became a mobster, and he kind of wound him up. His name was Richard Cain, appropriately, Cain and Abel. His
Oh,
last name was Cain, 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 Richard Cain. And he was involved in a kind of a separate attempt to kill Castro that was essentially sponsored by Giancana out of Chicago and such. And Giancana met a well-known singer. He was a widower. His wife had died a few years earlier. Giancana had 3 teenage daughters when his wife dropped dead, yelling at the kids, actually. She dropped dead. And so he was looking for a girlfriend, and he found one in Phyllis McGuire, who was a very well-known singer. Her sisters, the McGuire sisters, were a big act throughout America. They were on TV up there. And he was the boyfriend for Phyllis McGuire. And at one point he went to dinner with McGuire's sister and her husband. And he actually bragged about that Castro would soon be killed. And as I reveal in my book, the brother-in-law from McGuire, who was at that dinner and heard Giancana bragging about they were going to soon be killing Castro, they were already upset that Phyllis McGuire was involved with Giancana. So the brother-in-law went to the FBI, and they started checking it out. And the FBI was actually listening in to conversations of Giancana in Chicago through listening devices and such that were illegal, but they were being used at the time. And they were able to determine that there was indeed an attempt to try to kill Castro. So there were a lot of different alarm bells that were going off at various different points in the story. And it's, in a way, it's almost comedic. I mean, it's obviously tragic, and it's graceful in trying to kill people and such. But in many ways, there is almost a comedic level to the book as well, with the attempts and all the failed attempts, the kind of the gang that couldn't shoot straight, as they say, to borrow a line from the late Jimmy Breslin. And so there was all these different attempts and all of this intrigue that goes on in Mafia Spies.
There certainly was. And that's the kind of thing that just keeps me coming back to these stories over and over again. All the close calls and the brushes with danger and the intrigue and the two timing and everything. It really is amazing stuff. Thomas, I have to ask, so you mentioned, of course, that it was Roselli and Traficante and Giancana that came to the meeting at the Fontainebleau that Maheu set up, but who attended that meeting from the CIA side? Do we know their names?
Yeah, there was a guy named Big Jim O'Connell. That was his name. And he essentially was the point person. He was the handler for this operation. And Maier was involved very directly as well. So Maier was at this meeting, and O'Connell was at this meeting, and he was using an alias, and Johnny Roselli was using an alias, and Trafficante was using an alias. Nobody was using their real names at the original conversation at the Fontainebleau. So it's kind of funny. And of course, Roselli was no dummy. I mean, he smelt out right away what was going on. And so he finally says to the CIA guy, O'Connell, he says, "Come on, let's be real here." They were like in the backyard of the Fontainebleau when this conversation takes place. And O'Connell eventually puts his cards on the table, and Roselli is kind of an interesting character because Roselli impressed the CIA as kind of being a patriot, as somebody who he was in jail during World War II, and Roselli was not his real name. His real name was Sacco, and he was an illegal immigrant to the United States from Italy with his parents. Apparently, he had been involved in crimes in Boston, and the story goes is that he was involved in the murder, and he wound up as a teenager going from Boston to New York and eventually to Chicago. And it's in Chicago that he worked for Capone, and that's where he first meets. And so this is in the early 30s or so. And he's a very young man. He's a driver and such, but he suffered from tuberculosis. And so the cold weather in Chicago really hurt his lungs. So they sent him out to Los Angeles in Hollywood. And so during the late 30s to 40s, through after the war, Johnny Roselli essentially was like a mob enforcer in Hollywood, and he got to know a number of different Hollywood producers, and I talk about that in my book. And then, of course, he had the idea. He got involved with Las Vegas, so he became the mob's guy in Las Vegas, and that's really where the adult relationship of Giancana and Roselli takes root. It's in Las Vegas in the early 50s when the mob is investing, as other families like the New York families invested in Las Vegas. And that town was run by the mob for about 20 years or so, and at least 20 years. And that's kind of Roselli's story. But one of the big concerns in his life was that his real identity would be found out, that somehow somebody would find out that his name was Sacco. And they actually, the CIA and the FBI, who was running after the mob, they eventually did find out his real identity, and that also becomes part of the story.
Boy, there's just wheels within wheels here at all times. Not everyone lying to everyone else at the same time. It's really amazing.
Yeah, it was really hard to write the book in that regard because you just say, okay, what door do I go through here? And how or if you will, a long walk through the woods. At every fork in the road, do I go to the right or do I go to the left or do I go back? So it was difficult. It was difficult to write the book, and I was pretty happy that I think people can follow it, but it's a very complicated story with a lot of rabbit holes, which makes it enjoyable, I think, immensely enjoyable to write and hopefully to read.
It definitely does. It definitely does. By the way, before we go on, I want to tell you all about my new favorite fragrance for daily wear. It's called Novichok by Clandestine Laboratories. Novichok is distinctive and combines notes of cocoa powder, chocolate almond tort, jasmine, cinnamon, tonka bean, Peru balsam, and musk tonkin. Unlike some of the other colognes I've worn in the past, I've found that Novichok stays with me all day, which was a pleasant surprise. If the name sounds familiar to you, then you might already know why I was so happy to find this company and support them. The name itself comes from the very well-known Russian nerve agent Novichok, which has been used in recent years in several assassination attempts, which I've covered here on the podcast in previous episodes. The name is spelled differently, but rest assured, once you put this on, you'll still make a killer impression wherever you go. Novichok is made in small batches by Clandestine Laboratories and, like their entire lineup, is available only via direct order. If you're not sure which of their fragrances is right for you, you can also check out the Discovery Stash. 6 different mini bottles at one great price, which is perfect for finding your signature scent. So make sure to check them out either via a link in the show notes of this episode or at their website, clandestinelaboratories.com, or on Instagram at Clandestine Laboratories. So, Thomas, you mentioned early on in our discussion that the mafia guys, they were kind of expecting something like a get out of jail free card. And in fact, very much like a get out of jail free card. But was the CIA really in any position to offer this kind of thing, considering that they had not, of course, told the FBI, who was investigating the mafia, about any of this transpiring?
Well, to some extent, it was not. It was a reasonable thought on the mafia's part. That, in other words, There were instances where the FBI, almost as a professional courtesy, would defer to the CIA if the CIA let J. Edgar Hoover know that there was something going on that would impact their national security investigations or whatever. So there was a somewhat reasonable expectation that the FBI would back off. And in fact, I had mentioned about the FBI finding out, being told by Phyllis McGuire. Let's just to back up again. It's Sam Giancana, who's involved in the assassination with Roselli. Giancana is going out with Phyllis McGuire, and her brother-in-law, as I mentioned, tips off the FBI that Giancana is bragging about, that he's going to be killing Castro, and that's going to be in the news and such. And so the FBI starts investigating that. But then what also happens is that the FBI finds out that about that Phyllis McGuire apparently has a boyfriend, Dan Rowan of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, that who's courting her in Las Vegas at
Hmm.
the same time Giancana is down in Florida trying to help out the CIA try to kill Castro. So he Giancana finds out that his girlfriend is being wooed by the suave Dan Rowan, not Dan rather, Dan Rowan of last year, who went on to Rowan Martin's Laugh-In and became well known that way. But they were in Las Vegas together. And so what happens is that Roselli and the CIA say to Giancana, look, I know you want to go up there and kill him, kill Rowan, but what we'll do is we'll have two private eyes check out to see if it's even true that he's trying to steal your girlfriend, Phyllis McGuire. So they arrange for two private eyes to go into Rowan's hotel room in Las Vegas and try to wiretap, put recording devices on his phone. And while he's doing that, somebody from the security of the hotel finds out that they're doing this. They call the cops call the FBI, and now suddenly the FBI is checking out all of this. And essentially, they're going to go after Giancana and the private eyes and such. And in that circumstance, the CIA finds out about it, and the FBI backed off of the investigation of the wiretap that they had clear evidence of. They did that in deference to the request by the CIA that please don't interrupt our ongoing national security operation here. If you prosecuted this wiretapping at the hotel in Las Vegas, it would interrupt what we're doing. So, and that did go up all the way up to Bobby Kennedy as the Attorney General.
Yeah.
So, so it's really quite an amazing set of stories, and a lot of this didn't come out until many years later.
Right, right. I mean, certainly the CIA, if they have both the Kennedy brothers behind this effort, they've got the juice to squelch any investigation or indictment of Giancana and Roselli. But at the same time, both of these guys are committing. They're involved in ongoing multiple felonies, right? I mean, they've both been involved in people dying and disappearing and bootlegging and blackmail, extortion. I mean, like these are very serious criminals here. They can't just kind of hand wave away the crimes that they have committed and they're still committing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It became there were a lot of debates internally within the government. Certainly, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, was not happy about this. They were not happy about the fact that essentially the CIA was running a whole army camp in Florida where people being trained to launch an invasion from another country. The CIA, by its charter, was not supposed to be involved in any domestic activities. And here they were running this whole training camp down in Florida. And so there were a lot of different things. To me, I thought the role of Bobby Kennedy was really fascinating in this book, because in my earlier books about the Kennedys, Bobby Kennedy is a very sympathetic character. And I'm always very sympathetic to the Kennedy family as literally crime victims. I mean, to see first JFK killed before their eyes, and then Bobby Kennedy. The impact on that Bobby Kennedy's family is astounding, I've always tried to keep that in mind. However, in Mafia Spies, it is a fascinating role to see what Bobby Kennedy, and very questionable what he was doing, because he was the attorney general, but in essence, he was almost like the acting CIA director, directly involved in the operations of what was going on down in Florida. And there was a lot of denial on the part of him and some of his partisans, but the records are very clear that he knew about the attempts to kill Castro. And so I found that to be very startling in
Yeah,
my eyes.
absolutely. Absolutely. It really is a fascinating time period. That's one of the reasons that I keep coming back to it, and you've kept coming back to it. Just like you said, it's quite a period of American history there that deserves to be reexamined again and again.
Yeah, well,
So
I think it still raises the question today about, for instance, state-sanctioned killing, state assassination. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that's something that was in the back of the mind of with Dulles, saying, well, if we had killed Hitler earlier on, we certainly have seen that in our own time. Well, if we had gotten Osama bin Laden earlier, would 9/11 have been avoided? And perhaps we'll never know. It's like the big what if questions of history. So, but I think the question about assassinations is certainly we see that going on, that conversation still going on today.
absolutely, absolutely, it is. So of course we all know that these attempts were unsuccessful because Castro survived all of them. So at what point did this relationship end? Did they just decide, okay, that's enough attempts, or did the mafia decide that we don't have any more assets available? I mean, how did they go their separate ways?
Well, the very last attempt, that was the biggest attempt during that time period, took place actually November 22nd of 1963, in which there was a fellow named Kubela who was being courted by the CIA to kill Castro with poison pens and such. They were still using devices rather than guns and such. And Castro had already was well aware of the attempts to kill him, and actually was telling people in the press that, well, that not only the U.S. is trying to kill me, but two people can play this game as well. Words to that effect that he said literally in the time period leading up to the assassination. So when JFK was killed, in many ways, it stopped, because what happened was LBJ decided really to put his focus on Vietnam rather than Cuba. Up until that point, Cuba was the big hotspot, that in Berlin, actually, during the Kennedy years. And Kennedy was only nominally involved, relatively nominally involved in Vietnam. And so the focus of the Johnson administration was very much on Vietnam, and he really avoided the Cuba situation. If Castro was killed, well, so much the better. There was a coup d'état by the people of Cuba, so much the better. But he was not as involved in running a Murder Incorporated, which is literally what he used the term. He said, we're running a damn Murder Incorporated
Hmm.
down there. And so he was not going to get involved in that.
Okay, yeah, that makes perfect
It
sense.
really
So that is a
it
good
ended with,
dividing line. There
yeah,
is the November 22nd, 1963.
yeah, yeah, very much so.
So at that point, the guys like Roselli and Giancana and Traficante, they just go back to their normal criminal activities, and I guess they, continue to dodge the FBI to the best of their ability and all that. But I kind of want to fast forward a little bit to the church hearings, which I think were 1975, I believe, is when those took place.
Right. Well, yeah, you would think that it was all over at a certain point in the book, as I mentioned, dealing with the death of JFK, that it would end. But what happens is, very, very briefly and succinctly, Gene Kana, because of his involvement with all these various different things, he's pushed out of power as a mobster, and he winds up going to Mexico for a long time. Meanwhile, Roselli goes back to Las Vegas, and he, with Maheu, Bob Maheu, the cutout from the Castro assassination attempts, Maheu is working for Howard Hughes, and with Roselli, Howard Hughes buys out the mob in Las Vegas. He starts buying up all these hotels, including the hotel, the Sands Hotel, where Frank Sinatra has an interest, and Howard Hughes didn't like Sinatra, and he pushes Sinatra out of the Sands Hotel, which had been his home base when he entertained for many years in Las Vegas. So Roselli makes money by that, but then he buys Las Vegas, but the mob continues to take money off the top, and Hughes gets out of the business. Roselli is also involved in a card shark type of thing at the Friars Club in Los Angeles that the FBI gets involved in, and eventually they wind up finding out his real name, his real identity, and they're going to deport Johnny Roselli out of the country the way in which they had done with other mobsters. And so suddenly Roselli finds himself being exposed and being thrown out of the country. And he's very leery about that because that's a virtually death sentence for him. So he hires some pretty fancy lawyers, and around that time period, we're talking about the early 70s by this point, Watergate is happening. There's more revelations about what's going on with the CIA. That with Watergate, Nixon tried to bring in the CIA. So there was attention about the CIA, and eventually this thing about the attempts to kill Castro by the CIA slowly but surely leaks out. And the CIA is concerned that Johnny Roselli is going to rat them out about this. But other people find out about it. And eventually there are the church hearings that you were mentioning about. So this is around 1975. And Roselli, he does give testimony to the congressional hearings looking at the CIA. And he doesn't say much initially, but then it looks like they are going to deport him. And so he's agreeing to come back. And just as he does, he winds up getting killed. And prior to that, just like about a year prior to that, Giancana, who had come back to Chicago from Mexico, and he was being subpoenaed to talk about the CIA stuff as well, he winds up getting murdered in his house. So both the murders of Roselli and Giancana are at the back end of my book. Who did it is something. They both are unsolved crimes. No one's ever been prosecuted for either murder of Giancana or Roselli. It was very jarring to the Senate investigators who were working with them, and suddenly to have their key witnesses murdered like this. But in my book, I examine what happened and why and who might be responsible. And I think I have a pretty good idea of who was responsible for it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff, and the timing is an odd coincidence, to put it lightly, certainly, for that testimony. I'm curious, to your knowledge, were there any other unusual deaths associated with the church committee hearings at all?
Well, there were where people get into conspiracies and such, and I don't really delve into anything that I couldn't prove in my book. This story is the big conspiracy story that it took 50 years for the CIA to say, yes, we did try to kill Castro. And yes, we did hire the two mobsters, Johnny Roselli and Giancana. And they didn't do that until 2007, where they finally came clean about that. So that was, 50 years later or so after it was started in 1960. And it took until 2007 to the CIA formally to acknowledge they had a conspiracy to kill Castro. But I don't delve into a lot of other conspiracies, and I certainly don't try to come up with who killed JFK. That's not something I delved into. It's certainly part of the story here. It's a big part of the story, but I think I don't get involved in conspiracy theories in general. It's not what I do for a living.
Yeah, very understandable. I mean, the truth as you've laid it out is already complex enough as it is, quite frankly, quite interesting stuff. And actually what you said, that really struck a chord with me, because, talking about any kind of espionage activity in the 1960s. I've touched on the JFK assassination many times, and some of the people, I've kind of covered people that were accused of being involved or maybe were involved and that kind of thing. And I haven't really done anything, even any in-depth research into the JFK assassination, simply because I think that would end up consuming all of my time if I did, because there's so many theories and so many people and so many potential motives and all of that. So I've kind of left that one alone, just in a desire to cover a number of other stories rather than focusing on that one by itself, honestly.
Well, there is a big takeaway from my book. I think that people would, I think, have to weigh very heavily in examining the JFK assassination, and it's this: that the Warren Commission had on the commission Alan Dulles, who by that point had been pushed out of the CIA, but he's on the commission, and he never discloses, nor does the CIA or the FBI ever disclose to the Warren Commission about the attempt by the Kennedy administration to kill Castro. The Castro assassination plot was never known by the Warren Commission. And so if you're solving a murder 101, murder investigations 101, one of the first things you want to do is identify all of the possible suspects. Well, in this case, the commission never was told about the attempts by the Kennedy administration to kill Castro. And that didn't come out until later. And so people, Dulles flat out lied about it, and they kept that a secret. They kept the secret of the Castro assassination attempt secret for about 15 years. Gerald Ford was on the later president, Gerald Ford, was on the Warren Commission. He was a congressman at that time. He wasn't told about that. Other people just didn't know about it. But Alan Dulles went through all of that commission hearings into the death of the president of the United States and never disclosed, nor did Hoover or anybody else disclose to the commission what was going on with the attempts to kill Castro. And Bobby Kennedy was aware of it. And it was Bobby Kennedy who suggested that Alan Dulles be placed on the Warren Commission. He had a guy named Nicholas Katzenbach, who was an associate attorney general in the Justice Department. And it's Katzenbach who suggested to the incoming President Johnson that Dulles be put on the commission. And Katzenbach was later said that he was unaware about the Castro assassination attempts. So the big takeaway, I think, from Mafia Spies in regards to the JFK assassination is just the fact that when the commission tried to investigate who could be behind the murder of JFK, they never considered the Castro assassination plot, whether or not Cubans may have been involved at all with Lee Harvey Oswald, at least in relation to that attempt by the CIA to kill Castro. So, I think that's a big takeaway in reading my book. That stuff has been out there, but I think when you put it in the context of my story, I think that's a big takeaway. Why wasn't the Warren Commission told about the Castro assassination attempt? It should have been, clearly. And Gerald Ford said that later on when he found out about it. They should have been informed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, Thomas, you did mention that Giancana and Roselli were both killed right around that time period. What about Traficante? Did he go on to live a long, peaceful life, or did something happen to him as well?
No, he did. In fact, there's a quote, I think it's from Giancana, that says, "You can tell who was behind something by whether or not they're the last man standing." And in this case, the last man standing, or the last two men standing, are Santo Trafficante and Castro. His involvement with this, he clearly was, particularly as I go through the records, and clearly as you would read in my book, Mafia Spies, Trafficante slow walks the attempts to kill Castro. Now, why is that? Because he seemed like he was very much aligned with the mob, and in other words, he had a foot in both camps. If Giancana and Roselli were able to kill Castro and the mob came back into Havana, well, that's great for Trafficante. He was going to be involved in that. He was going to get part of that. But there was also the narcotics trade. that Trafficante was involved in. The mafia was involved in that as well. And that involved the transportation of drugs throughout the Caribbean, and in which Cuba was part of it. And Cuba, there was a certain amount of money that was made from the drug trade that the Cuban government was able to tap into and such. And so it appears as though, and certainly the record that I examined suggests that Trafficante was not only involved in the narcotics trade, but that it was necessary to have the involvement of the Castro government as well. And so that he became essentially a double agent in this case, and that he slow walked a number of different things, and also probably provided information that undermined the attempts to get rid of Castro. So, he was definitely a double agent in that. And there's also record that suggests that he was involved in the murders of both Giancana and Roselli. In Giancana's case, he was murdered in Chicago. But the murder weapon in that case eventually came back. The tracings on the gun came back to a gun shop in Tampa, Florida. Not exactly, most murders in Chicago don't have that type of thing, where the gun traces back to Florida. But that's Trafficante company. So there's certainly the suggestion that an assassin came up from Florida to kill Castro, or was involved in getting, not Castro, excuse me, the murder of Giancana in Chicago. The Trafficante was involved in that. But more directly with Roselli's murder, there's a scene in my book where Roselli goes to lunch with Trafficante, and they go with Trafficante's wife and another person. It's Roselli's sister, but there's 4 people. And basically, Roselli knows he's a marked man. And it's coming out that he's now testifying before the Senate about this operation that the rest of the Mafia Commission did not know about. This was like a freelance thing that Giancana was involved with Roselli. But essentially, Roselli is pleading for his life. And two weeks later, he winds up dead. So the investigative files about the Roselli murder usually points to Santo Trafficante. That didn't die until like 15 years later, something like that. He died of natural causes. And of course, didn't die until a few years ago. So he died, I think he was 91 or 92 years of age. So he died as an old man. And it's really amazing that he survived all of these attempts. But I think Mafia Spies puts the light on the reasons why he was the last man standing. And we realize that Castro had a very complex spy system, not only in Cuba, but in southern Florida. And he was tipped off quite a bit. And so that's how he managed to survive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, really incredible stuff there. He led a charmed life, but he also prepared in so many ways, like you said, by infiltrating South Florida. So tremendous amount of intrigue, from Tampa on south all the way to Cuba, as we can see here. So what a story. And I have a feeling I'll be coming back to Cuba in the 1960s in future episodes as well, because I really can't get enough of this stuff, honestly, Thomas. But
well,
fascinating book.
As you had mentioned, I had done a book previous to this about Masters and Johnson, which primarily was about love and sex, not necessarily in that order. But so it was like on one end of the human spectrum, if you will, about love and sex. Mafia Spies is on the other end. It's really a whole examination of violence of a state-sanctioned violence with assassination. It's the violence of the mafia for economic reasons, that they get rid of people who clash with whatever ventures that they have going on, casinos or other type drug trades, all these type of things. But there's also the craziness of the psychopath violence of some of the people involved in the mob, particularly with Giancana, who just love to kill, some stake killing, would literally torture people. And that was part of the instrument of power for Giancana. In other words, how does a guy like John Gotti in New York or a guy like Sam Giancana come to power? Often it is through sheer terror, through violence, through the ability to have people who whack people who murder people, and that's how they enforce their power through sheer violence. And to find psychopaths who enjoy doing that and have them as your soldiers and such, that's all part of the story. So to me, Mafia Spies is also an examination of American violence in all of its forms and this kind of tragic and comedic at times aspect of it. Almost like the type of flavor that you see in The Sopranos. That's the big part of the flavor of this book as well.
Yeah, it was really amazing stuff. Honestly, I'm very glad I picked it up and that we had the chance to talk about it as well, Thomas. So, are you working on another book now? Is there going to be a fourth in your unofficial trilogy?
No, well, I am doing a new book. I'm not really at liberty to talk about it right now, but yeah, it's kind of in the same different era, but it is a spy book, and it's in the same somewhat in the same vein, but it's a different era. And so it's a lot of fun. And I do enjoy writing books about espionage because they do involve human beings in desperate situations, but also involve at times politics and such. So it plays to a number of my interests. And I'd like to think that Mafia Spies is certainly one of the better spy books that's been out there in recent years. I definitely think the story of the two mobsters hired by the CIA to kill Castro is one of the great, or the terrible, great spy story. It's one of the great mysteries of real life mysteries. And so to be able to do it through the framework of the two mobsters, kind of as a buddy movie, was the great appeal for me in doing Mafia Spies.
Yeah, well, I have to agree, and I've got to give you my endorsement there because I've read many spy books over the past few years, nonfiction, and this one certainly stands out to me as one of my favorites. And that was why I was so excited to get the chance to talk to you about it as well, because it's such a great book and very readable for anybody out there who is interested in picking up the book. There's no way that we can do it justice, in just 90 minutes here. So it's called Mafia Spies: The Inside Story of the CIA, Gangsters, JFK, and Castro by Thomas Maier. So I really encourage you all to pick it up and give it a read yourself. Thomas, is there anywhere online that you have like a public profile that people can connect with you if they want to learn more or find more about your books?
Yes, I have a website called Thomas Maier Books at gmail.com. So it's THOMASMAIER books, BOOKS, at gmail.com. I know that's quite a handle.
Okay.
That's my
Great.
website.
Yeah, I was able to find you quickly, so I'm sure they'll be able to as well once they start looking. So, and we'll have your name in the show notes and everything, so people can find you too with the spelling, so that won't confuse them at all. Well, thank you, Thomas. This has been really interesting stuff. It's a great talk, and I'm glad that I picked up the book and that we were able to get in contact as well.
Thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate the invitation.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Take care.
You take care. Thanks.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101 and at cold.war.stamps. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.